for want of a better expression, a crude expression, there is a crony capitalism. There is a capitalism where basically the big guys are protected, are insulated from the consequences of the decisions, and it's the ordinary man and woman across the world that is left to pick up the pieces.
Most books that have been written on this topic have really been critiques from the left, which are arguing against capitalism and saying that capitalism is all about greed and about cronyism and, without sort of introspecting that, okay, what's the solution? Is it more government? But if I'd say if there's one symbol of what's gone wrong with capitalism, it's...
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th, then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th, and finally the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there. When Keir Starmer and his ministers came to office, they said they had one priority among all others: growth. And beneath the noise and the fury of British politics, there is actually almost universal consensus about one thing: that the British economy is, and has been for a long time now, utterly lousy. And that growth is the escape route of the nightmare of a national pie which hardly ever gets bigger, but where there is an ever-strengthening appetite from the public, from the state, from different government departments to consume what is there. The problem for Starmer and that promise is that the clouds hanging over the British economy look increasingly heavy and foreboding. Government borrowing costs are rising. The markets seem convinced that the British economy is stuck in a rut, and increasingly perhaps less convinced that Rachel Reeves has an answer. In today's show, we ask how much of it, if any, is Rachel Reeves' fault? But we're also going to be asking a bigger question. Doesn't this go beyond any government or any Chancellor? Haven't we been talking about the weakness of our economic model for such a very long time now? All the way back since 2008. Aren't you bored? Aren't you tired of hearing politicians tell you that there's only ever pain to come? One endless economic night. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe there is something very fundamental going on. So in today's show, we're going to be talking to a man who thinks he has an answer to what's gone wrong, not just with British capitalism, but Western capitalism overall. He thinks he has not only the question, but the answer too. Welcome to the Newsagents. So, a little bit later in the show, as I say, we're going to be going very big and asking that exact question with Ruchir Sharma, who has, handily enough, written a book on that very title, What Went Wrong with Capitalism, named one of the best political books of 2024. First, though, let's go a little bit narrower and think in more detail about the events of the last few days. A reminder that over the last 48 hours or so, British government borrowing costs have reached their highest point since 2008. Indeed, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Rachel Reeves' deputy, Darren Jones, was forced to the Commons on Thursday to insist that everything was fine.
We have set tough new fiscal rules that are non-negotiable, with a budget settlement for public services that they must all live within. And we have kick-started growth in this country, the number one mission of this government, by unlocking investment and bringing forward reforms, for example, in planning and the Mansion House speech. So might I say, Mr. Speaker, to the right honourable gentleman, that this is in stark contrast to the negligent, shameful horror of a circus performance that the Conservative Party unleashed on this country when they were in government a few years ago. And until he can come to this House with an apology for the British people, I will not take any lectures from the Conservative Party about how to run the economy.
Needless to say, that is less than ideal. There have been calls, as we were saying yesterday, for the Chancellor to cancel her trip to China in the wake of what's going on in the bond markets. There has been criticism across many of the papers saying that Labour has put the economy into an economic doom loop, especially after her NI tax increases on business. Well, how accurate is that charge? How much of the instability can we lay at Rachel Reeves' door? Paul Johnson, of course, is the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul, could we just start? Could you just lay out? It's a curious thing, isn't it? Because actually on the surface, nothing much has changed. There's been no change in British economic policy. There have not been any sort of significant new announcements on the kind of health of the British economy, although there were some negative ones towards the end of last year. Why are the markets suddenly increasingly skittish about British bonds?
It's a very good question, and why it's sudden, I don't think anyone can really explain, because not only has nothing changed here in the last few days, nothing has changed anywhere really in the last few days. What seems to be happening is that we're being very heavily influenced by what's going on in the US, where returns on their debt is going up, which is related to, I think, some concerns both about some of the policies that Donald Trump might pursue, but in particular the expectation of higher borrowing under a Trump regime. Lots of markets have followed the US market, but we are particularly exposed, not just because we've got low growth and lots of debt. Lots of countries have low growth and lots of debt, but also we're particularly dependent on foreign investment and foreign buyers of our gilts. We've got a very big external deficit. Put all of that together, and we're being more affected than most. It's not, this is not fundamentally a response to the budget back in October or particular aspects of Labour's policy. It's a response to the broad-based weakness of our fiscal situation and of our essentially balance of payments deficit.
So in that case, would you say that the criticism of Rachel Reeves and her chancellorship up to now is unfair, that this is largely the result of international factors, or does the budget have at least some hand to play?
Well, the budget has some hand to play because it did increase borrowing, and it increased borrowing quite significantly in the short term. So despite those very big tax increases, there were actually even bigger spending increases announced at the budget. So there's more debt to sell, and that hasn't helped. And there's a large amount of government debt that needs to either be sold or rolled over this year. Again, most of that not down to what happened in the budget, and it is, it's really hard in the 6 months or so that the government's been in office to make a big difference to things. But I think as I say, there are three concerns I think the markets have that are specific to what's happened. The first is that we are borrowing more than we were. The second is that there have been the tax rises that there have been for employer national insurance, which creates some concerns about growth. And the third is that the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves has set herself, she's only just meeting. And I think there are worries about what happens next. Will that mean more tax rises? Will it mean breaching those fiscal rules? What would the politics be around spending cuts if they had to be introduced?
Look, it doesn't feel as if the markets are going to reach crisis points in the immediate future, though of course anything is possible. But it does remind us that we have entered a new, or rather a return to an old era. That is the new environment that Rachel Reeves is operating in. One where the bond markets act as a kind of financial policeman to government action. Aside from the brief Liz Truss belch, we haven't had anything like this for a long time. In the long economic boom years of the 90s and 2000s, there was no whiff of sovereign debt crises among established economies. Growth was strong, debt was manageable. Remember, it was less than 40% of GDP in Britain's case for most of this period. In the post-2008 era, though Western states became more and more indebted, they could rely on the salve of near-zero interest rates and borrowing costs. At one point, such was the demand for sovereign debt that markets were almost willing to pay states to hold their bonds. All of that is now over. Countries, including Britain, are highly indebted, they have huge liabilities, and markets are increasingly skittish about their long-term abilities to pay them. In that sense, this era we're in now is starting to feel closer to the 1970s than anything we've seen in these last decades. And that has a particular resonance for the Labour Party, which has its own particular history and folk memory of the damage the international markets can do, and often do, to a Labour government. They helped bring down the first Labour government in the 1920s, and more recently, more searingly, there was the ignominy of a Labour Chancellor, Denis Healey, having to turn his plane around from an international summit as Britain slid into what we were told at the time was insolvency, and had to take his begging bowl to the IMF and insist that government cuts were the right thing to do to his party.
I'm going to negotiate with the IMF on the basis of our existing policies, not changes in policies. And I need your support to do it. But when I say existing policies, I mean things we don't like as well as things we do like. It means sticking to the very painful cuts in public expenditure on which the government's already decided. It means sticking to a pay policy which enables us, as the TUC resolved a week or two ago, to continue the attack on inflation.
Labour took decades to recover from all of that, and it wasn't really their fault at the time either. So in a sense, today isn't really about whether any of this or how much can be placed at Reeves' door yet. Because either way, she will just have to live, as Dennis Healey did, with the consequences. And those consequences are made worse because of the political decision she made not to increase taxes on income and the rest, which means that her room for manoeuvre is now looking vanishingly tight. Do you think, I mean, as you say, one of the fundamentals is that Rachel Reeves, even after the budget, had very little fiscal headroom, even if she intends to meet her fiscal rules. If she is serious about not breaking those rules and borrowing costs hover around where they are now, who knows, maybe they could go up, they could go down, but if they hover where they are now, do you think that it is inevitable that Rachel Reeves will have to either increase taxes or cut spending or have some combination of the two?
I don't think we're talking inevitable yet, because there's all sorts of moving parts here. All of this is going to depend on what the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecasts are in the March statement. Now, there's all sorts of things that might move. They might change very slightly their views about growth or inflation or the welfare budget or what have you, all of which could move in a direction that's helpful to Rachel Reeves, all of which could move in the other direction. So we're not in a world of inevitabilities, but in a world in which they do move in the wrong direction, then Rachel Reeves really has very, very few choices. I can't see her breaking those fiscal rules, particularly given what we've seen in the gilt markets over the last few days. I think she would consider that too risky. That leaves her with the option of announcing some tax rises in this spring statement, which is not supposed to be a fiscal event. She really said she's only going to have one budget a year, so we shouldn't really be seeing tax increases in the spring. But because of the slightly curious way in which the rules work, what she could do is announce some tax rises for the future. So, for example, in the budget back in October, she didn't extend the period for which income tax allowances and thresholds are being frozen. She could decide in March, well, actually, I'm going to extend that for another couple of years, and that would help her a fair bit. The other option, of course, is to cut plans for spending. Now, plans beyond next year for spending are already really quite tight, and she's going to have a very painful spending review in June when she allocates that money across departments. But probably the most likely thing that she'll do is make that spending review even tighter, and therefore probably set herself up for some very nasty conflicts with her cabinet colleagues as they agree those spending totals over the summer.
The politics of a Labour Chancellor having to cut even further into public services when, as they say themselves, their whole vision for seeing off populism is to make those services and the state work better could be ghastly for Starmer's premiership. And though much of this is beyond Reeves' control, it is the legacy of her predecessors, she's being buffeted by international forces, I do think that they're more unmoored than they might have been. That task has become even harder than it might have been for one reason, which can more credibly be laid at her and Starmer's doorstep. There is an old Henry Kissinger quote, which I think is true across time and political space and applies now. The task of the leader, he says, is to get his people from where they are to where they have not been. And the paradox of government is that it spends the intellectual capital it gathers when it is out of office in the process of governing. The biggest weakness of the Starmer-Reeves project, I think, is that they didn't do much of that intellectual accumulation, that thinking about what they might do outside of office, that there weren't many answers about the central question facing them and all social democratic governments. How do you do social democracy in a time of scarcity? And the radicalism you might need to make the economy not scarce anymore. Too often instead, they relied on quite simplistic explanations. They said things like this.
Stability, that's what's on the ballot paper at this election. Are 5 more years of chaos with the Conservatives? Or stability with a changed Labour Party? Because at this election, stability is change.
That was Rachel Reeves before the election. The diagnosis was that the Tories' fecklessness and instability was at the root of Britain's ruin. Look, those things didn't exactly help, but it wasn't the only problem. There's stability now. There is no prospect of an election or an unstable parliamentary situation. But stuck in a rut, we still are. You can be stuck in a rut entirely stably. And that's for now, and they do have time still, where we are. If the government is serious about raising living standards, it's going to have to prove Kissinger wrong, that they can walk and chew gum, think anew on the job with all the pressures coming their way, because Plan A is wobbling. But maybe if Reeves wants to think big about not just what's gone wrong with British capitalism, but capitalism overall, she could do worse than listening to our next guest. Stay with us. Right, as I say, let's think bigger picture now. Now and again, I want to bring you a political book which I think has something genuinely revelatory to say. Sort of informal political book club on a Friday, if you like. And Ruchir Sharma's 2024 book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism, is a great place to start. He spent much of his career in international finance, also in journalism, and the book is deeply arresting because it sort of says that both the left and right have some justification on their side in their critique of modern capitalism, and left and right, in a sense, are wrong as well. That politicians need to think deeply about rewiring the whole model. I'll let him take it from here.
I think that the main point I'm trying to make in this book is that capitalism did not fail, it was ruined. And it was ruined by government. How so? Because if you look at the narrative of capitalism that we have today, it is that we have been in this so-called neoliberal era for the last 40 to 50 years, where the government has been in retreat, the markets have run amok, and the ordinary person is getting shafted in this process, and that capitalism is somehow unfair and it's not helping the average person. And I'm saying, yeah, I completely agree with the critique that capitalism in its current form is not helping the average person, and the average citizen in UK, US are all very disaffected with the system, and therefore we have the strong trend of anti-incumbency across the developed world. But the main point I'm making is that the system we have today is not really capitalism. It's very far from what the founders had in mind. It's essentially socialism for the rich. Risk has been socialized. So on the upside, there's capitalism where the people who gain get to benefit. But on the downside, risk has been virtually socialized or eliminated, particularly for the rich. So it's a very asymmetric form of capitalism that we have today.
Could you just explain what you mean by that and give some examples in terms of a kind of socialism for the rich? Because it's a very arresting kind of phrase, which you say, I'm sure will resonate with some people and confuse others. What exactly do you mean by that?
I'm referring to, let's say, for example, the bailout culture. If any big company or any major industry gets in trouble, the government, sort of is there to bail it out. This culture of bailouts has become all prevalent across the developed world. But on the upside, the gains are yours. So, so it's like the central banks, the governments, they behave as if anything goes wrong, especially if you're in business and you're in big business, we're here to protect you and we will do what it takes, because it could be what they call a systemic risk. But on the upside, the gains are yours. So it's this capitalism on the upside, socialism on the downside. The people who benefit the most from the current system are the established, the rich, people who have access to it.
And you sort of talk about in the book kind of where this comes from, where this culture comes from, and the idea that we've almost become, in terms of our culture, our political culture, we've almost become highly resistant to the idea that there can be recession, or that businesses can fail, or industries can fail. But that has kind of led to, at least in part, the problem you're describing.
Yeah, and it's a very self-serving argument, because the argument, it's a sort of modern down version of trickle-down economics, which is that, that the rich and the powerful and the top have to be protected because they're the ones creating the jobs. They're the ones who are providing employment and other benefits. So they can't be allowed to fail, or they can't get in trouble, because if they do, it'll hurt the entire society. So they have to be protected at any cost. So I think that's really the culture that we have gotten into, and that recessions, which used to be a way of cleansing the system, of clearing out the deadwood, those have to be avoided at any cost. And I think that what we forget is that there is a cost to all this. There's a very insidious cost to all this. You take countries such as UK or the US, and one sort of cost I see to this idea of protecting everyone and avoiding recessions is that you're left with so much deadwood in the system. How so? Look at the number of zombie companies that we have today in places like the UK and the US. Zombie companies are defined as companies that don't even earn enough to meet their debt servicing burden for 3 years in a row. You know, this term was first coined back in the 1990s or became popular in the 1990s in Japan, when the Japanese economy was slipping into a downturn or at least stagnating. And lots of companies in Japan were kept alive with government support, with very easy money support of the central banks. The press in the US and the UK would sneer at that, say that that only happens in Japan. You know, here we Western capitalist societies don't do that. The number of zombie companies in places like the US and UK as a share of the total number of listed companies then was barely 2 or 3%. Fast forward today, the number of companies classified as zombie companies in UK is more than 20%. And in the US too, it's close to 20%. So those are staggering statistics. So the number of companies which should not be out there and are surviving on artificial support or very easy money and don't really make enough money to cover even their debt service burdens, those are more than 1 in 5 of the listed companies. And that has real consequences, because when you keep alive so much deadwood, then you're not allowing new entrants to come in the market. You're slowing that down. And we see that, at least before the pandemic, the number of new startups in much of the Western world was slowing down dramatically. So you're keeping alive a lot of the deadwood. And that what also creates this feeling amongst the average person, the average business, that the system is rigged against us because, like you're keeping alive so many of these old established players and at the expense of new ones entering.
And to be clear, that is because the rise of these zombie companies, which I think is a really interesting sort of part of the book, has arisen because of a combination of a long-standing era, albeit one that's come to an end now, of cheap money, very, very low interest rates, and a culture, as you say, of persistent government bailout and support to the economy to avoid even the kind of most shallow and minor recession. So you put those two things together and you basically have a load of companies which continue to exist, which shouldn't exist, and then that is a big part of the reason why our economies aren't growing as they should be.
Absolutely. So those are the two key things that you've identified. And I would extend that to a third factor, which I think has become a big thing in keeping alive a lot of the deadwood, and the point that you allude to, which is that why our economy is not growing more quickly, because productivity growth has fallen. In places like UK, as you know, productivity growth, which is really the key to long-term economic growth, productivity growth has essentially been zero for many years now. And another key reason for that is the number of new regulations that the government puts in now. Thousands of new regulations a year, and barely ever withdraw any of the existing regulations. Now, what does that do? New regulations come into place. The cost of imposing those new regulations and following those new regulations tends to be very high. And so that, again, is a barrier to entry for small businesses. And another effect of that is that who are the people who help draft these new regulations? It's often the big companies. They're the ones who draft these regulations. They have the maximum number of lobbyists in the capital cities. And so that, again, argues for the fact that it helps big business at the cost of the small businesses and allowing new businesses to enter. So these are all factors, I think, are stifling growth and productivity in the economies.
But where do you think, Ruchir, that that compulsion for the kind of regulatory state to get bigger and to get bigger and to get bigger, and this obviously this is an international thing. This isn't just one country, as you say in the book. This is a very much an international phenomenon. There are a couple of exceptions which you kind of praise, and we can come on to those. But generally speaking, it's an international Western phenomenon. Why does it happen? Why has it happened? Where has it come from? Because it's even happened, as you say, on the watch of parties of the right who, on paper, are against it.
Yeah, well, as that old line goes, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So you can argue that the government thinks that because it's in power, it's trying its best to help people. It's trying its best, like to protect. But in doing so, it's causing much more damage. So this entire compulsion that we got to do like everything to protect. And I think that the economic thought process has changed. Uh, it really started after the Great Depression, I would say that before the great so the book, as you know, is a long-term history of capitalism. So if you look at the first 200 years of capitalism, the government's role was virtually unchanged. The government's role was essentially that we're going to deliver your mail and we're going to do some defense spending, but beyond that we're not really going to get involved in the economy at all. So take places like the US, the government spending as a share of GDP was roughly stable at about 3% right up until the Great Depression. And then, as they say, a strength taken too far becomes a weakness, because such was the belief that the government should do absolutely nothing, that even as the economy began to crumble after the bubble of the 1920s, the government thought it was almost best to liquidate, to let the bubble burst, and that would set the stage for a new boom to come. And that didn't work out because, in terms of you caused even more pain and more distress, there was no welfare state. And so that then led to the opposite thinking rising, which is that the government has to now do whatever it takes to prevent these downturns. So I think that's where this big pivot begins. And I think that after the 1970s, that has got turbocharged, possibly by a couple of factors. One, that there is no disciplinary mechanism left, right? There is no gold standard, there is no mechanism. So the central banks can print as much money they want. The US, with the world's reserve currency, can keep on running these deficits. So there's no governing mechanism which is left. And whatever the negative consequences of low productivity, those feel so intangible, so insidious, that no one really feels like, doing anything about that.
But Ruchir, is there not also a case to say that it is partly because the demands of the 21st century are different to the demands of the early 20th century? I mean, in a period that you're talking about when US federal spending was at 2 or 3% of GDP, the population was much younger, the welfare state barely existed. Democratic populations have very different expectations of their governments today. And, if we look at the UK, for example, what's one of the main drivers of the ever expansion of government spending? Well, it's health spending, social care spending, because we've got aging populations. We've also got bigger military threats now. So isn't it hard? I mean, part of this is that even if you have, and we've had governments in Britain, for example, who have, I think, earnestly wanted to shrink the size of the state, but they've found that the kind of exigencies and the compulsions upon them have been too great, and that we are just living in an era of bigger state and statecraft.
Absolutely. So I think, you're completely correct. There's no returning to this Dixonian form of capitalism which existed before the 1920s. So I agree with that. But I'd say that how long are we going to continue down this path without there being a crisis? And we may be staring at one even as we speak. So, there are limits to how much you can do that. And more than that, I think that there are aspects of government intervention which are not even popular. You talk about the fact that there are popular demands on the government to spend on health and other things. Now, we can argue that what are the quality of services we are getting in return for all that spending and taxation. But more than that, there are areas where the government is acting which are not even being demanded by the populace at large, but the government's still doing that. The bailout culture. I know in countries like America, where I live, bailouts are deeply unpopular. And yet, at the slightest hint of trouble, the governments there still sort of, fearing another Great Depression or whatever, rush to the rescue.
But Ruchir, isn't Trump is the ultimate embodiment of that, isn't it? I mean, the American economy is booming, and what's Trump talking about? He's talking about more and more stimulus. He's talking about tax cuts.
Absolutely. So I think, and that's been, one of my forecasts for 2025, that I think that he's going to pay a price for that. Which is that because this has gone on too much and too long. So even in America's case, America used to run a budget deficit of about 3% of GDP for much of the, the 2000s and the 2010s. In the last 5 years, America's budget deficit as a share of GDP has averaged 8%. And today it is over 6% still, even though we are in the midst of a so-called booming economy. And so that tells you that this has really gone out of control, and the bond markets are beginning to react to that. So I think that you're correct that Trump too wants to do that, because all these people think that there are no apparent consequences to it. So why not just throw more money? The easiest thing to do is to spend other people's money. But I think we are coming to a time now when the market is going to start revolting. We have seen that in the UK. We have seen that in emerging economies such as Brazil. We have seen signs of that in France. And I think that could happen in the US as well. But more than that, I think that what Trump and all have to think is that what are the reasons as to why he got elected to office, and what can be done to possibly win a re-election, which in today's day and age, even for him, he may not get re-elected, but for any party in the developed world to get re-elected has become almost impossible. And if you keep doing more of the same thing, you're going to keep losing more elections.
So do you think that we are potentially staring down the barrel, partly because of some of the reasons that you described, of another profound economic crisis?
Well, I don't know if you call it a profound economic crisis, but I think that we are reaching the limits now to how much the government can keep spending and what the government's role in the economy can be without there being a backlash from both voters and a backlash from the financial markets, from voters as well. Because if you look at the surveys today, the number of people who have trust or faith in the government has fallen to record lows. In places like America and UK and stuff, most people had a pretty favorable view of government 50, 60 years ago. Today, the faith in government, if you look at the surveys, is down to about 20% or something. So the government may be doing a lot and expanding its role, but obviously the delivery or the results are so sort of lackluster or mediocre that the voters are revolting to that. I mean, if this entire government largesse and government spending was working, then surely the governments should be getting re-elected. Instead, we have the instance that the last year, 85% of governments that stood for re-election in the developed world lost. 20 years ago, at least 50% of the governments would win their re-election bid. Now, 85% of governments in the developed world are losing their re-election bid. So if they're going to keep doing more of what they've done over the last 20 years because of whatever the demands that you cite, well, they're going to keep losing more elections.
It strikes me, I mean, I don't know if you found this in terms of the reaction to your book. I mean, what I found compelling about it is that it sort of says that the left and the right are both correct, or at least both parts, or at least both elements of a left and right critique have some truth to them. Right in the sense that you're saying, governments have been spending too much, they're not getting enough for their returns, the regulatory state is failing, there is too much regulation. But also you seem to be saying that there's something in the left critique as well, which is there is basically a kind of, for want of a better expression, a crude expression, there is a crony capitalism. There is a capitalism where basically the big guys are protected, are insulated from the consequences of the decisions, and it's the ordinary man and woman across the world that is left to pick up the pieces. How have you found in terms, I mean, that must have kind of slightly complicated the reaction to the book from some quarters, because there's a bit of something for everyone, but also presumably something for everyone to dislike.
Yeah, exactly. So I wasn't quite sure how the book would be received, but luckily I think it's seen to be a bit different than what the standard critiques have been, because most books that have been written on this topic have really been critiques from the left, which are arguing against capitalism and saying that capitalism is all about greed and about cronyism, and without sort of introspecting that, okay, what's the solution? Is it more government? And I think that from the right as well, one of the big criticisms I've had of the right is that they conveniently back tax cuts. Like in the US, I see this all the time, that tax cuts are fine even if they expand the deficit, because somehow tax cuts will lead to this big growth miracle which will solve all problems. And I've said that where is the evidence of that? Like in terms of that you can cut taxes, but if you don't cut spending, it's an irresponsible thing to do. So I think that the book, in a way, says that the state of affairs we are today is the result of a bipartisan project that's been carried out for the last 40 to 50 years in both the US and in UK and Europe. But my entire point is the fact that the first step to a cure is to identify the problem. And I think that this is where even the left is not doing a good job of identifying the problem. Even today, I find it really bizarre that a lot of left-wing politicians keep saying that the central bank should be cutting interest rates, should be running easy money policies. I'm like, okay, who are they really benefiting by running these easy money policies? Who are the biggest victims of inflation? In terms of that these easy money policies have promoted. It's the poor, the middle class, which get hurt most by inflation. So I find these contradictions need to be addressed, and I find it the fact that if both the left and the right have taken offense of the book or taken it on board, I mean, that's fine. I'm going to write, what I have to write.
Do you think? I mean, obviously we've got a very sluggish economy in the UK. We've got Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, struggling to get growth back. I mean, if you were to advise her on what she should be doing, what would you advise? And is there an example? I know you talk about a couple in the book. An example of a country that we might look to emulate?
Yeah, I think there is no utopian nation. And in the book, I have a chapter pointing out to 3 countries where capitalism is moving in the right direction. I'd say in the heart of Europe, there's Switzerland, the world's richest economy in terms of per capita income. And what are they doing right or have done right by keeping the role of the government to a basic level, by not being that strict on regulation? And then I point to economies like Taiwan, which have been very tech savvy, where government spending as a share of GDP is barely 20%. And yet the technology is so good in delivering services to people that the Taiwanese government is relatively popular, and they're able to get by with just government spending at 20% of GDP. And the third country I point to is a communist country in Vietnam, which, it tells you that if you give people more economic freedom, like China did 40, 50 years ago, how much you can achieve, in terms of the results. So those are the 3 examples I quote. But specifically on UK, I think that in terms of cutting back on the regulatory state, cutting back on a bailout culture, and possibly a topic we haven't spoken about, but if I'd say if there's one symbol of what's gone wrong with capitalism, it's housing prices. This is something which I feel just doesn't get enough attention, because the consumer price inflation data doesn't measure housing prices. But the fact that housing has become so unaffordable for most people that many 20-year-olds today are still living in with their parents, that the basic dream of doing better than their parents has been shattered. I think that the fact that so much of the income is going on housing or has just become unaffordable is the single biggest issue that needs to be addressed by any Western government, including in UK. And what can you do to increase housing supply, rather than have it choked by regulation? How do you make housing more affordable? Making homes affordable again should be the number one agenda for any government. And that's both populist in a way and also good economics.
Ruchir, been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Book's fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lewis. So enjoyed the conversation.
Right, that's almost all from us this week. Sharma's book is really, really thought-provoking. I cannot recommend it enough. As I say, it's called What Went Wrong with Capitalism. It's published by Alan Lane, and it's out now. If there are any politics books or authors you'd like us to review, interview, you can let me know on lewisgoodall@global.com. Thanks. That is it for us this week. What a first week back. No John or Emily this Friday, of course. They, like Michelle Obama, decided to decline their invite to the Jimmy Carter funeral, so they're off windsurfing in Hawaii with the former First Lady. Remember, if you're so inclined to leave us a review for the podcast and send us story trips and feedback to newsagents@global.com. And remember to buy tickets for our national tour. Just search for Newsagents live on stage or get your tickets from Global Player. Our production team on the Newsagents are Rory Simon, Georgia Foxwell, Arvin Badawal, Shane Fennelly and Natalie Inge. Our executive producer is Louis Degenhardt. Our editor is Tom Hughes. It is presented by Emily Maitlis, John Sopel and me, Lewis Goodall. We will be back on Monday, and if you can't bear, heaven forfend, to be without my voice until then, remember to join me for the best Sunday political show on the airwaves since David Frost last had breakfast, Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC from 10. See you next week. Have a lovely weekend.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.